I'm Alexander Rose, the Executive Director here at Long Now. I'm joining you from the Interval here in San Francisco, where I'll be joined by Adam Rogers, our speaker tonight, who is going to be speaking about the history and future of color and perception and culture. Adam Rogers was one of the very first speakers we had here at the Interval way back in 2014 on his last book, Proof, which was really a kind of a similar study, but on alcohol and culture. But tonight, he's going to be talking about both the science and history of color and perception and how it has affected civilization through time. Welcome, Adam Rogers.
Thank you, Xander. It's good to be back. I want you to picture, in your mind, the quintessential yellow. So not an object, not a yellow thing, not a lemon, but just yellow, not orangey, not greenish, yellow. Okay, you got it? Now, I don't know if this is it for you. This is how a lot of computers code like yellow. And of course it'll look different on every screen because nobody calibrates the colors of their screens and all screens are different. All things being equal though, and this is a little bit weird, the yellow that you would pick as perfect, as quintessential, if somebody shined a light and gave you the controls of the dials to pick a perfect yellow, is probably very, very close to what another person would pick. Of course, all things are never equal. We measure color in a lot of ways: saturation, brightness, intensity, and those metrics vary from place to place and time to time when we talk about color. Let's try another warm-up. Now I want you to picture your perfect green. So not bluish, not yellowish, green. Okay, you got it? Now here's a weird thing. The green in your head right now is almost certainly not the green that someone else would think of or would pick as their quintessential green. People vary by a lot. If you do that thing where you shine the light in their face and let them control the dials, it'll vary by as much as 60 nanometers if describing colors by their wavelength is your thing. This is a good green. It's fine. It's a little yellow for me, actually. But an important question to ask here, I think, is why would this green not be your perfect quintessential green? Because the blue-green region of what scientists call a color space, the entire multi-dimensional range of colors and variations in colors possible and perceivable, is a brutal place. It is a weirdish wild space. Now, partially this is because of how your eyes and brains work. Partially it's a function of your personal experience, of philosophy, of language, of all the green lights you've ever seen, every traffic signal, every green field of England, every blade of grass, every incredible Hulk. Color is physics. Color is culture. You probably remember something from elementary school called primary colors. And the idea of those is that you could have specific colors, or really, and we'll talk more about this too, specific names for colors that we agree upon, and then somehow try to understand how those colors mix and come together to form all the other colors, because of course color is a continuous sort of curve or waveform, I guess. There's red, yellow, blue. Those are the primary colors I was taught. There's red, green, blue. Those are the primary colors your computer was taught. There's the Munsell primary colors, which is a system of organizing color. This sort of unifies them all for comparison's sake. You can see how different they are. Around the outside is what Isaac Newton called the spectrum. The middle ring are the artist's primaries and secondaries. And the inner ring are the additive colors. Red, green, blue, shine light, put those together, they mix and form other colors, and the subtractive or reflective colors that you'd find in a pigment: cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, CMYK. History is littered with the rubble of attempts to put colors into some kind of order, to make them behave, so that printers and painters and dyers and weavers and digital animators and artists of all sorts and people every day can use them, can take this mysterious but ubiquitous feature of the universe and turn it into something that we change, that we transform, and that transforms us into a technology. So here's the hypothesis. When we talk about color, we are actually talking about three separate but related and overlapping things. So first is color that happens without us. The tree falls in the forest, it's green even if we're not there to see it tumble. That's physics, chemistry, the oscillation of electromagnetic fields moving in a direction. Electromagnetic energy streaming from the sun, hitting Earth's atmosphere, interacting, hitting other surfaces and particles. Light. 1.21 sextillion photons hitting every square meter of Earth's sunlit surface every second. Color is something that we make. Colored things by dint of our hands and our effort and our cognitive abilities. Roman purple, Egyptian blue, mauve. Colors that didn't exist on Earth or anywhere in the universe, maybe, until human ingenuity makes use of all that physics and chemistry to make them happen. Usually we call these things pigments. These are things that absorb some colors of light and reflect others, presenting a color to our eyes. The image that you see there are jugs full of quantum dots. Eventually those are going to be part of LED TVs. It's arguably one of the most advanced way people make colors today. And third, there's the color that our eyes and brains manufacture from those other two things. Light all around us bounces off or through or among surfaces into our eyeballs, where hideously complicated biological sensors transduce photons into neuroelectrical signals. The image that you see now is Ramoni Cajal's hand-drawn map of a mammal's retina. That comb-looking part up at the top are the rods and cones. Those are the photoreceptors at the back of the retina that perceive light and color. This is Isaac Newton's original spectrum with colors added later. He didn't draw the colors in when he did it. Famously, in 1665, he goes on the run from the plague and hides out at his mother's house, closes up the shutters of the study he's working in, pokes a hole in the wall, sunlight comes in, he lets that sunlight go through a then relatively new optical technology called a prism, and sees on the opposite wall colors splayed out in a line. The eyes and the brain don't perceive the same world of color that the universe creates. What we think of as color is, like all the other senses, just an approximation. So, that first way of looking at things, this is going to be familiar to you. This is the electromagnetic spectrum. Colored light is, in one sense, just the teensiest part of the physics that surrounds it. And this sort of makes sense why it's that narrow band, because we're using meat sensors to perceive it. Longer wavelengths would cook those meat sensors, and shorter wavelengths would ionize them into little balls of cancer. We humans call anything between about 380 nanometers and about 750 nanometers, we call that stretch visible light. Those are colors to us. You can see here that the peak spectra of the three of them that most human beings have in their eyes. People call those red, green, and blue, or short, medium, and long wavelengths. But you can see that the peaks aren't well distributed, and the tails overlap. This is, like everything else in our meat suits, an evolutionary kludge. And in some humans, one or two of them doesn't work. Some rare humans have a whole other one of them in there, in between the green and the blue. They are tetrachromats, as opposed to most of us trichromats. But the wavelengths it responds to still fall inside the range of what we tend to call visible. But look at this. Birds. Birds are tetrachromats. They see colors way down into the ultraviolet. And bees, they're trichromatic like us, but they don't even bother with red. They're seeing the green and the blue and then ultraviolet. The natural world positively glows to these other animals. We can't even begin to imagine. I mean, we can begin to imagine, but we don't see what they see. They have other colors. And look at this show off. This is a mantis shrimp, 12 photoreceptors into the UV and near infrared, jerks. I mean, now, except for the colors out on the edges, most scientists don't actually think that the mantis shrimp sees more colors than humans. It might not discriminate among a zillion where we only do a cajillion or something like that. It does do it faster, the connections between those receptors and what passes for a brain in a mantis shrimp. I'm not trying to be offensive, but mantis shrimp. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that color is quite literally in the eye of the beholder. What colors we see depend on our biology. The cones sensitive to long, middle, and short wavelengths all do something called quantum catch. They're kind of adding up the number of photons they're receiving at the energy levels that they're sensitive to. This is a function of the proton structures around them responding to that energy. They aren't just sending red, green, and blue signals back into the brain. They're combining their signals with each other and with other kinds of neurons adjacent to them and other kinds of cells that are helping that process, doing complicated calculations within the eye. They're also doing overall number of photons to calculate brightness or intensity, because the amount of light and dark is part of the way we perceive color. And then that all reaches back. You can see in this diagram, those two circles at the top there are eyeballs. Everything else is brain. And once you get into the brain, what you would love to say is like, oh, well, there's like a part for red and a part for blue and a part for green. But no, it's not like that at all. The parts of the visual cortex may or may not map to specific colors, perceptions of colors. The neuroscience community has been arguing about this for decades. We don't even really know completely why we or anything else sees color at all. Clearly, it's some kind of information. Clearly, it's evolutionarily useful. Part of the answer might be here. If you're local to Long Now, you might recognize the salt ponds at the southern edge of the San Francisco Bay. Those colors come, at least in large part, from salt-loving extremophile microbes called halobacteria. Halobacteria aren't bacteria at all. They are members of the kingdom Archaea, the oldest life on Earth, 3 or 4 billion years old. Obviously, they do not see. They don't have eyes. They are 6 microns long. They have color, which means they have pigments, lots, in fact. And they also know how to avoid blue light and swim toward orange, which is weird because, again, no eyes. So halobacteria have a protein called bacteriorhodopsin. They're using it not to perceive light, but as a proton pump. They turn light into energy. But the thing is that while the overall structure of the protein is pretty close to ours, the individual amino acids that make up that protein are different. It's like making the same spaceship with different Legos. So no one knows for sure if our color vision evolved from their color vision, or if color vision is so evolutionarily valuable that evolution just comes up with it again and again, and over time, the same approach with different structures. Nobody knows. It's good for something. And we humans keep making our own colors to feed our appetite for it. This is Blombos Cave. It's on the coast of South Africa. It's been the location of a bunch of really exciting archaeological finds over the years. Some of the first ornamental beads, one of the first drawings the human beings ever made. Between 10 and 20 meters down, about 100,000 years old, the archaeologists who worked that cave found something remarkable. These are abalone shells. In the one on the right, you can see a little rock down at the bottom, and it's sort of molded to the shape of the inner surface, the nacreous substance on the inside of the shell. And you'll see also some reddish color there. That's ochre, an iron oxide. These are tools for grinding that ochre down, for mixing it with, they found samples of what's called trabecular bone, like you'd find in the spine. It's sort of fat and marrow and cartilage, porous and gooey. These are tools to mix all that together and make a pigment, to turn ochre into a paint. It's the oldest known example of human beings taking a natural material and turning it into colored stuff they can use. The archaeologists who found them, led by a researcher named Christopher Henshelwood, called these toolkits. Blombos was a workshop for making color technology. But by the time you have people painting, for example, the insides of the caves at Lascaux in the south of France, tens of thousands of years after what was going on at Blombos, you have a pretty wide palette. Now, this isn't obviously enough of a gamut to depict the entire natural world, but there's a lot of color there. You've got the ochres, there's some coppery stuff for green, the blacks are magnesium and carbon, like soot, that's easy because you've got fires. And sometimes you'll have something almost always calcium carbonate based for white. And it's enough to make some really striking image like these. These are from the simulated Lascaux cave that the French built just outside the real cave. But you can also ask, could the people who painted it also have had other pigments? And the answer is yes. Maybe they had a blue made from flowers or something. We know because they were humans that they saw color like we do. We don't know if they made colors like we do. I mentioned the color white a second ago. People actually argue about whether white is a color or not, an achromatic, something without color. One eminent color scientist called it this, though, the mother of all hues. To some extent, the history of the way human beings have interacted with color has been a steady or a punctuated progress of having more and more pigments and more ways of making things have colors. But throughout all that time, one of the most steadfast principles, you have to have something to make white, something to be a substrate that you can put other colors against, something that when you mix it can either make those colored things lighter or give them more opacity or make them brighter. So that essentially has been having to have a white pigment. White is one of the bases of the axis that you can measure colors and brightness by. It's been omnipresent in coloring Roman buildings. In the same era that it was making ceramic in the Tang dynasty, it was also became the basis for makeup that women there would wear, all the way up through those famous pictures of Queen Elizabeth with the sort of white cake on her face. That was all white. People really vibe on white stuff, though. Calcium carbonates include things like lime and also kaolin, which is the mineral that make ceramics and fine porcelain possible. People have tried to make white pigments out of all kinds of stuff, in fact. Partially, that's because you need it to mix with other pigments to lighten them and brighten them and make them more opaque. But white's actually tricky because where most pigments, as I said, absorb some wavelengths and reflect others, white has to reflect pretty much all of them, but not back the way they came, because that would be a mirror, basically. White is organized disorganization. It refracts every wavelength, every which way. For something to be white, the particles inside it have to scatter all wavelengths equally and efficiently. Water droplets suspended in air are very good at this. That's clouds. Protein and fat suspended in water is very good at this. That's milk. For most of human history, though, the big white was this, lead white. It was a component of makeup. It was a component of house paints. It was a thing that artists used. Of course, lead white was also scary because it was hugely toxic. And everyone knew. They knew since ancient Rome how toxic this stuff was. So much so, because there was so much use of it in the 19th century for industrial uses and for paint, because everybody wanted their world to have nice colors, that the hazards of it had become the incentive to invent the entire field of occupational safety. It was a mess, which means the world was open to a replacement. In the late 1800s, an engineer named Auguste Rossi came from Italy to New York, and he made kind of a business out of understanding titaniferous ores, especially because people were trying to mine iron out of the Adirondacks and make steel, and that was like 25% titaniferous. So at that point, most people thought that the way you would make good steel out of something like that was to take the titanium out. But in 1908, Rossi noticed that the chemical process he was using to purify titanium produced, as one of its intermediate steps, a fine, brilliant white powder. He mixed it with salad oil and famously brushed it across a piece of paper. This was a big moment. Rossi knew about the dangers of lead, and he understood the hegemony of the national lead conglomerate that was selling the stuff in paint. So he and his partner added a new business line, titanium dioxide pigment. That's the basis for all kinds of paints and coatings. It has a huge refractive index. It's opaque and it's bright. You find it even in coatings and paints of other colors. It's the main ingredient in a lot of those paints. You also find it in coatings of pills, some kinds of paper, almost every cosmetic in your medicine cabinet, sometimes in the white sugar powder on supermarket powdered donuts, because it's relatively inert. Used to be an Oreo filling. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry internationally. It drives a huge amount of business. The bright colors of modern art, of the industrial age, of streamlined modern, that's this stuff. And it's everywhere, even today. Sprinkles and Sudafed and toothpaste. This was all part of what one historian has called a chromatic revolution. In order to make products seem new and modern, they took on new colors. And that started a kind of an interrelationship, a dynamic where new technologies would create new colors, and those new colors would inspire people to create new technologies, back and forth. Even though there's some kind of crass capitalism involved there, the transition in a really weird but I think real way of Dorothy walking from Kansas into Oz, of a world that goes from being not black and white or sepia tone, because of course that's just the way people now will think about it because we're influenced by the way the movies looked, but colors that were more likely to fade and that were more likely to be earth tones, into something vivid and vibrant that we think of as the 20th century and now the 21st. And it was titanium dioxide, really, that was one of the things that made that possible. What didn't exactly change, though, and what's still kind of unclear, is how we talk about those colors. This is changing direction a little bit, but I want to ask you another question. Do you see the color blue in this painting? This is the painting Athena appearing to Odysseus to reveal the island of Ithaca by Giuseppe Bottani. It's a depiction of a scene from Homer's Odyssey. Those stories, or rather one specific read of those stories, sparked a tremendous controversy that an increasingly colorful world only made worse. Does everyone see the same colors if they don't have names for them? Or read that differently. What do you call the colors between the ones you know the names of? And what does that say about you and your culture and about how the brain works? Because color is a really good way to understand linguistics, which makes it a really good way to try to understand cognition. In 1858, 10 years before this guy became Prime Minister of England, he wrote a book called Studies on Homer and the Homeric Age. He pointed out that Homer never used a word that meant blue or green in the original. Sure, the sea might be wine dark and dawn might be rosy fingered, but what does that even mean? Gladstone had a hypothesis. The ancient Greeks, he said, didn't see color like we do. They didn't say blue because they couldn't see blue. That's nonsense, of course. They were humans, they had human eyeballs and brains, they didn't lack the blue photoreceptor or have different eyes that function differently than ours. And, maybe the ocean wasn't blue, maybe it was green or black. But most translators today agree that the Greeks were using color words just differently. Those were colors that meant something to them, that had what scientists call salience. You remember those color orders that I showed you? Plato's version of that went from white to black. And one of the primaries that he used was translated roughly to sparkling or brilliant. That was a specular illumination. That specular look was something that they valued. So that may be what the wine dark sea was all about. Still though, the idea that some people, other kinds of people didn't see color as well as nominally civilized colonialists did, that was a pretty sticky idea. So Grant Allen thought that he would test it out. Allen was actually one of the inventors of both science fiction and detective fiction. But Allen tried a cool experiment. He sent letters to, as he said, missionaries, government officials, and other persons working among the most uncivilized races. Not above a bit of casual racism was our Grant. He sent those all over the world, asking those people to ask the locals a bunch of questions. And the answer at the end basically was, yeah, they all see the same colors. They don't all have the same names, and sometimes they don't have some names for colors at all. But if you teach people the name in a different language, they pick that right up. People were seeing the same colors, they just didn't call them the same thing. It had something more to do with culture than with biology. This was all anecdotal, of course. What all this eventually led up to in the 20th century was a mutation of idea into what's now called linguistic relativism. Sometimes this is called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, after a Harvard linguist named Edward Sapir and an autodidactic fire investigator, self-taught linguist named Benjamin Whorf. And the most simplistic version of the idea even defining this is controversial, but just work with me, is that the things that you have words for in your head are a limit on what you can actually think of and about. Language is thought. Like I said, color is a very good tool for thinking about language. So you can test this, or you can try. In the 1960s, two linguists, Brent Berlin and Paul Kay, had noticed in their fieldwork that some languages had fewer basic color words, things like yellow and green, like I asked you to imagine up at the top, that didn't mean anything other than a color, than other languages did. Some languages had fewer than others. Why? They decided to do a more rigorous version of what Allen had tried to do with his letters. What Berlin and Kay tried to do was ask people basically which colors are which, what they're called, which ones are subcategories, what names do you have, and so on. And the crazy thing is, they found a pattern. They found that all languages develop color terms in a specific order, they said. First, they start with white and black, then they'll include a red, then you get either a green or a yellow, then you get both, then you get blue, and so on. It turned out to be pretty wrong. Under fire for potentially some racial assumptions, and also because they talked to people who were bilingual, so the languages would be overlapping, and a bunch of other things, they tried it again. They went big. They went not to bilingual speakers in the California Bay Area, but to informants around the world, dozens of different languages and places. And they found that what was going on was much more complicated and mannered, that languages tended to separate their color spaces into light colors and dark colors, and then develop more words as needed from there. What we're talking about here is something called categorical perception. It's the ability to distinguish among stuff and name that stuff. So having words for things really does matter. This is just a small example, but Russian speakers have two basic color terms for blue. They have a light blue and a dark blue. I won't try to pronounce those because my Russian is, I don't have any Russian. So whereas we just have blue, they have two. If you show people those colors and then one of the other ones, so a triangle test, two of one color, one of the others, Russian speakers are faster at telling you whether the third one is the same or different than the others, than English speakers are. The hypothesis there being, the idea being that if you have the words for it, then you can see it more quickly. You can think about it more quickly. What you'd really like, though, if you wanted to try to separate cultural and linguistic influences on color perception from like innate biological categorical perception of color, you would want something that could see like a human, but didn't have language. So I recommend one of these. This one is mine from many, many years ago, and you can't have that specific one, but something like this. And seriously, no, for real, this works. You do what Anna Franklin at the University of Sussex did. You strap some 4-month-olds into car seats and make them look at colors. Because babies, if they see something unfamiliar, they look at it for longer. It's kind of a basic tool in developmental psychology. And you can tell what categories they distinguish between and which ones they don't. If it's something they haven't seen before, they look at it longer. If they've seen it before, it's already in a category, then they look at it for shorter. Anna Franklin tried this and found at the end, basically, that babies see red, green, blue, yellow, and purple. Before language, these are the categories of color. But what are the categories for? What do they mean? In 2017, a couple of researchers, Ted Gibson, who's an information theorist at MIT, and Bevel Conway, who's a color vision researcher at the NIH, and sort of my guru in all of this, they tried the same kind of show the colors game with speakers that the Berlin and Kay folks had tried, with native speakers of English, Spanish, and Chimane, which is an indigenous language in South America. This shows which modal terms or basic color words the speakers of each language used for Munsell chips. It shows that Chimane had fewer speakers had modal terms for those colors than Spanish or English did. But then they tried something new. They played a sort of guessing game. They would take the color chips and try to see how long it took people in each language to describe a given chip, to explain which one they meant to a person they were talking to. And the idea was that if you had fewer words to do this, if it took less time to do it, that meant that the color was somehow more information efficient in the language that you were speaking. So these are from the top to bottom, different languages, English at the top, then Spanish speakers, then Chimane speakers, and right to left, information efficiency. It doesn't really matter which specific colors do which, because you can see what the overall divide is there. You can see that there's a division between what someone who's an artist, like Conway is, would call warm colors and cool colors. So there's roughly the same difficulty conveying the idea of the same colors. But in both, colors in the warm, longer wavelengths are the ones that are more efficient. Why are they more salient? You can tell as many evolutionary just so stories about that as you want, but this is sort of clear proof that at least they are somehow. Okay, so what's next? That's how we make colors and think about colors now a little bit. But because of that relationship between technologies for making colors and thinking about them, this is all changing. A couple of years ago, I went to a lab at MIT researchers named Liang Shi and Michael Fauché. They work with a 3D printer to try to basically forge paintings. Not for criminal reasons, but what they're trying to do is print paintings that look indistinguishable from the originals, no matter what color light you look at them under. Now that's a big deal. The way the eye and brain remap the colors that we're seeing to account for the color of the surface, the thing that we're looking at, but also the color of the ambient illumination is a vast mystery. Nobody really knows how the brain does it. And what they wanted to do was create a printout, essentially, of an image that would look the same under the same kinds of different lights as the original. So to do it, they kind of reached back into the past. They took a process called halftoning, putting little dots of color next to each other to make color printing. That's how color printing works. Familiar if you're a fan of comic books or magazines or neo-impressionism. But instead of limiting themselves to cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, the classic colors of magazine publishing, they added a bunch of pigments. Red, green, blue, violet, orange, even a titanium white, of course. They used a machine learning algorithm and told it to look at colors that it saw in the world and figure out how they changed under different illumination, and then come up with print the same colors that the originals. They were able to pull it off almost completely. That's an original on top, and then the copies are below. Basically, every scanned pixel of the original gets a three-dimensional like hyperspectral reflectance map that the computer then recreates with pigments and the 3D printer, multiple layers of 3D printer. Now, there's some kind of color physics going on there that figures out how light interacts with surfaces, but nobody knows what that physics is. Shi and Fauché don't know. They left it to the machine algorithm, so they don't know how it works either. The computer is able to make fake colors that nobody else knows how to make somehow, and nobody has yet asked the computer. One of the things that the color scientists that I talked to were most excited about were the possibilities less of like high resolution screens and more of wider gamuts. So the color gamut is what colors are able to be shown by a screen. And the idea isn't that you'd be able to show colors that people can't see, but to capture more colors that they do see out in the world. So right now, if you have a screen with too narrow a gamut and you try to show a sunset, let's say, you won't, it'll like cover up the colors that it can't depict. So everything will just look like the same yellow instead of a bunch of yellows and golds, let's say. So a color gamut, a wider color gamut, is part of what new and oncoming standards in high definition TVs and digital televisions will have. But they were actually more excited about high dynamic range. And dynamic range is a different axis in color space. It's the light to dark axis, not the colors, the actual hues. And if you can increase that axis, if you can make the dark super dark and the bright super bright, you can show more colors, you can expand the gamut. But also, some people think that you can even get more like emotional range. There's a researcher at Dolby who studies neuroscience as well as how to make better screens. And she says that if you have really, really super high dynamic range and you like look at fire, for example, that your skin will respond as if you're seeing heat. Pixar animators use the 6 primary color laser projectors of Dolby high definition digital cinema and the ultra high dynamic range ramp from bright, bright white to black, black, black. And they're doing experiments with inducing after images, using really bright colors to induce the after image that's the complement of a color so that you'll see colors that aren't really there. More colors and colored things are still coming. Every time people learn new color science, they use it to make new color technology. Like these are all samples for possible paints for cars. And the way you do this is you include in the paint mica, little flakes like cornflakes, and they reflect light in different directions and different amounts of light in different ways. So you get the sort of, when you move around the car, it's red over here and green over there. But mica actually comes with a lot of impurities. So they're trying to use artificial synthetic mica, maybe Vantablack, nanoscale, nanostructure black, that's the blackest black ever known. Or maybe what you see here. This is work from the researchers Jin-Gyu Park and Ben Rogers at Harvard. These are structural colors. They're not made from traditional pigments at all. They're nanoscale structures, tuned beads of styrofoam, actually, that reflect light mechanistically rather than chemically. I don't know if you're an entomology fan, but a lot of beetles have really extraordinary carapaces. The armor that they have, some of them's really specular. It looks like metal, glowing. And there's one called the Siphoculus, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, that's ultra bright white, brighter even than titanium dioxide is. And it does that not because there's any white pigment in it, but because the way that the nanoscale, the way its armor is structured. And after that, I don't know, because Of course, no color is impossible. There's no missing shade of blue. Even if the ones that we can see are limited by our own biology and our own neurology, the colors that we can make are probably not. Thank you.